It felt like someone had been clawing at my insides, pulling, scraping, like they were hollowing me out all morning. The school bus rumbled along, carrying us up the twisting, unforgiving mountain road. A bus of kids should be precious cargo safeguarded, not dangled over every cliff edge. I glanced over at Tom, steady as ever, his face a mask against the nausea clawing up both our throats. His facade was stronger, but I knew the memories gnawed at him too, lurking just beneath. 10 years had passed. We were only 7 and 8 back then, riding home from school with our mom on that sweltering afternoon. She'd been running late, leaving us to bake in the sticky leather seats of our old station wagon. I'd won the front seat in a sprint against Tom and leaned my arm out the open window, trying to catch a hint of breeze. We were almost home when my mother's scream pierced the air, drowning out every other sound. I barely had time to see her wide-eyed horror as a little girl stepped out into the road in front of us. In a blind panic, my mother wrenched the wheel, but we slammed headlong into a truck barreling down the lane beside us. The car launched like we'd been plucked out of reality, thrown into a warped nightmare. My vision turned to a blur, a sickening high-pitched ring seared into my ears. I remember Tom's voice, a ghostly murmur through the ringing, urging me to move, to get out. I blinked and saw him pointing flames creeping from beneath the twisted hood. I wriggled out of the shattered window, my body dropping onto the scalding pavement. Glass shards bit into my hands, slicing as I pulled myself away, legs twisted and useless. Tom scrambled out behind me, his face as pale as ash. He tried to help me stand, but we could both see it. The fire was growing, licking closer to where Mom was still trapped. Mom! My stomach clenched as I looked at her, pinned and mangled in the driver's seat, the metal twisted around her like a monstrous claw. Her eyes flickered, locking onto us with something almost gentle, even then. She tried to speak, her lips moving slowly, but the words were lost in the hum, the endless shrieking hum. Tom dropped beside me, his hands clawing at the door, desperate to pry her free. Tears streaked down his face, mirroring my own, as the fire drew closer, consuming everything. The heat was blinding, suffocating, but it was nothing compared to the terror. I crawled across the glass, getting as close as I could, my bloodied knees scraping forward until I reached the window. Her hand, a broken, trembling shadow, reached for me, and I reached back. For one final, agonizing second, our fingers brushed, just long enough for me to feel her warmth one last time. The next thing I knew, arms were dragging me backward, a firefighter pulling me away as the sirens screamed. It was the last time I saw my mother alive. The last image burned into my mind was the blaze erupting into the night sky as the ambulance doors slammed shut. Years have passed, but Tom broke down recently, whispering about Mom's screams, muffled yet searing through the flames as they swallowed her whole. I'd have probably broken down alongside him if I'd really heard anything clearly back then. But it's like trying to grasp a memory wrapped in fog. A blur, pieced together in fragments only he and I can understand. The strange thing? The crash report, the official version, reads like something from a stranger's life. They say they pulled our limp bodies from the twisted metal at an intersection, an SUV smashing into us just around the corner from school. We'd never even touched the highway. But in our minds, it's the same memory every time. My mom, swerving to avoid that girl on the road, our car catapulting into the abyss, the fire, the screams. No matter how far back I rewind, it's still our truth. Today, Tom and I found ourselves packed into the rear of a school bus, high school students now, clutching our stomachs as it lurched up a steep mountain road on the anniversary of her death. Maybe it was supposed to be some sick test of our courage to sign up for the trip. A kind of haunted pilgrimage up to the mountain's peak to study ecosystems, or so the biology teachers told us. But Tom and I, we just needed to blend in. At the meeting point, we slid to the back of the line, hoping to spill over onto another school's bus, the one rumored to be filled with beautiful girls. Maybe if we could distract ourselves, we could survive the ride. We took seats at the back, clutching the worn plastic armrests, hoping the churning dread would settle. It didn't. After half an hour, Tom gave me a forced smile. The one I knew he wore to mask whatever darkness was eating him up inside. He rose from his seat, gripping each one as he wobbled forward, flexing his arms with each step, like he was trying to make it look like a joke. He slid into a seat beside two brunettes, launching into some ridiculous story from last year's trip, trying to charm his way into their smiles even as he held his stomach. Somehow, even through the nausea, he could play the part, an entertainer to the end. But I was different. Watching him, I felt a pang of jealousy gnaw at me, like I should have been doing something too. Yet, the very air around me felt thick and distorted, every turn of the mountain road twisting tighter, pressing in on me, squeezing the breath from my chest. I stared out the window, watching as the cliffs loomed closer, the pale sky swallowing the view in a deadened gray. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, trying to drown out the rattle of the bus floor beneath me, just waiting for the feeling to ease. It never did. As I glanced up at the rows of unfamiliar students, my vision started to blur, the faces blending, merging. Somewhere up ahead, I caught sight of Tom, laughing with the girls. His fake smile cracked just enough for me to see the shadow beneath. The road stretched on, the mountain looming above, and something in me knew no amount of charm, no distractions, could escape the ghost waiting around every curve. I doubted I'd find someone like her again. My eyes drifted to the girl sitting alone in the seat just behind the driver. I could only see her profile, but that was all I needed. She had sleek, pale blonde hair that fell just below her shoulders, and a stillness that made her beauty almost eerie. She looked better than any of the girls. My brother was charming, and I knew he'd agree if he noticed her. But she sat there alone, without a single person near her. It didn't make sense, almost like she was too perfectly out of place, like she was waiting. I don't know why, but I kept staring, maybe a bit too long. Almost on cue, she turned and caught me, her gaze piercing, as though she'd known all along. She didn't look surprised, just gave a slow, knowing smile, and I felt my stomach twist violently, dropping my head in shame. But that sick feeling was creeping back, worse than before, the churning pulling me into something deeper than nausea. I wanted out. I wanted to be home, away from this strange, endless ride up the mountain. As the bus snaked along the sharp turns, I tried to keep my focus on the stretch of road visible through the windshield, just to anticipate when the next turn would throw me. But then, I saw it. The road ahead abruptly ended, a narrow ledge ahead of us dropping into empty space. The bus driver was fiddling with the radio, his attention miles away from the cliff we were about to plunge over. I screamed, voice raw, as the edge came closer. A hush of collective terror settled over the bus. At the last second, the driver jerked the wheel to the left, the tires squealing as we skidded. For a moment, everything slowed, the sensation of tilting over the cliffside, the screech of rusted metal grinding against the flimsy guardrail. We collided hard, the guardrail bending under the weight, but miraculously not breaking. I felt the wheels beneath me lift, hovering over empty space. Outside the window, I glimpsed the lake far below, a mirror of cold glass waiting to shatter beneath us. The bus swayed, hanging in a fragile balance as a gust of wind brushed past, making it creak, groaning against gravity. Somehow, the driver managed to coax the wheels back onto solid ground, inch by inch, until we were safely back on the road. But as we drove on, I didn't feel relief or fear, just a numb, hollow emptiness. We stopped at a rest area further down, where another teacher exploded into a furious argument with the driver. The rest of the students were too rattled to continue up the mountain, every one of us desperate to turn back. I drifted to the farthest picnic table, isolating myself from the others, too tired and shaken for conversation. Raindrops started to tap lightly against my head, but I barely noticed. That blank numbness from the edge lingered, filling every part of me. If someone had told me how I'd feel, nearly falling to my death a second time, I'd have never believed it would be like this. A quiet emptiness, as if there was nothing left to feel at all. My hands shook slightly, but my mind felt oddly calm, detached. My body seemed to understand that we'd almost died, but my brain hadn't caught up. Tom, meanwhile, was deep in conversation with the two girls he'd charmed on the bus, draping his arm over one of them, talking in a soft, soothing tone. It was surreal, really. Here I was, trying to process what had just happened, and he was still focused on impressing these girls. I wasn't interested, I just wanted to be anywhere but there. Far from the bus, far from the driver, and far from this eerie mountain. Then, my eyes found her. The blonde girl from the bus stood by the vehicle, leaning against its side, still alone. When I looked her way, she was staring straight at me, and this time I was the one caught. She didn't look away. Instead, she held my gaze, then began walking towards me, her eyes cold and unflinching. "Did you think we were going to die?" she asked as she sat down beside me. Her voice was so calm, it sent a chill through me. I tried not to let my surprise show. "For a minute, yeah. But it's not a big deal," I replied, forcing a shrug. "We weren't that high up. We might have even survived the fall." "Oh, we were going to die," she said, her voice too certain. "Have you ever been in a car accident before?" A lump formed in my throat. Talking about my past accident was the last thing I wanted. "Yes," I finally managed after a pause. She tilted her head, studying me. "Not exactly," she replied, her tone distant, "but I've been close." I was starting to feel uneasy. Her voice, her calm demeanor, it was like she wasn't even talking about herself. Before I could say anything, she leaned closer, locking her cold eyes on mine. "I was here before. A long time ago. With my mother," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "There's something I want to show you. Just a bit up that trail." She pointed toward a narrow path disappearing into the dark woods. With her other hand, she reached out and gripped my arm, her fingers cold and unyielding. "Come with me," she whispered, her gaze never wavering. "It's something you'll never forget. It'll shock you more than what happened today." Behind her, I caught sight of Tom, grinning, amused by our strange interaction. He raised an eyebrow and flashed me a quick wink before turning back to his conversation, leaving me alone with this girl and her unblinking stare. The rain was steady but light, and we had at least 2 hours before another bus could come for us. I didn't have a reason to refuse her, though something in my gut told me to stay put. But her cold hand remained on my arm, urging me to follow, and I ignored the warning. Without loosening her grip, she guided me down the trail, pulling me deeper into the woods. No one noticed us leave, no one called out, or even looked our way. I followed her through the towering cedars, the rain forming little puddles in the dirt path. After a few minutes, she abruptly veered off the trail, dragging me through tangled brush. I tried asking if she knew where we were going, but she didn't answer, just kept pulling me further and further into the darkness, as if we were walking towards something she'd been waiting to find for a very long time. Finally, we broke through the dense forest into an eerie clearing. Fog clung low to the ground, weaving around jagged patches of grass and rocks. I guess the mist was because of how high up we were, but the silence made it feel otherworldly. Ahead, the land rose into a plateau about 30 feet up. She kept her grip on my arm as we climbed, until we reached the top. In the center of the plateau, there stood an old, weather-worn picnic table. Its presence was unsettling. Who would have carried it all the way up here? And why? She finally let go of my arm, walking forward in that same calm, deliberate way. She beckoned me to sit with her, patting the bench across from her. The fog was so thick that I could barely see more than a few feet off the cliff edge. I couldn't shake the sense that the drop-off beyond the fog was endless. I approached cautiously, feeling a cold, gnawing dread deep inside. "Do you want to be here?" she asked, her voice low and unnervingly calm. She raised her arms, palms open towards me. "Do you really want to be here?" I hesitated. Her question hung heavy in the silence, but something compelled me to reach forward. "Put your hands against mine," she whispered. "I'm going to show you something." I looked into her eyes and felt a pull I couldn't resist. My hands found hers, and the moment they touched, reality shifted. I was back on the school bus, the pale gray sky barely visible through the windows. Confused, I looked around and saw my brother with the girls he'd charmed. The blonde girl sitting up front alone, just like before. But something was different. Every sensation was sharper, darker. A sickening twist gripped my stomach, worse than anything I'd felt on the actual ride. My ankle throbbed, pain creeping up with a familiarity that shouldn't have been there. I tried to cry out as the bus neared the same deadly turn, the driver's attention still fixed on the radio. I could see it, hear it, every detail exactly as before. My mouth opened to scream, but no sound came out. A high-pitched buzzing filled my ears as if drowning me out, and then we plummeted off the cliff, smashing through the guardrail. That sickly calm settled over me again, broken only by the sensation of my body crushing against the water. And then, just as suddenly, I was back on the plateau, my hand still against hers. Her smile had changed, now it held something darker, knowing. But before I could pull away, the world shifted once more. I was on my knees, burning asphalt beneath me. The sun beat down mercilessly, and my ankle gave out as I stumbled forward, shards of glass piercing my hands. I looked up, and there it was, the twisted wreckage of my mother's old station wagon. Her arms stretched toward the doorframe, fingers just inches from mine, but no matter how much I crawled, I could never reach her. Her face was shattered and bleeding, and then she screamed. It was a sound that cut through everything, piercing the very air around me, and for the first time, I understood how lucky I'd been not to hear it as a child. I tried to scream back, to let out the agony clawing its way up my throat, but still, no sound came. The world began to spin, my vision blurring in the haze of blood and glass. I looked back at my mother, trying to bring her shattered image into focus, but my gaze drifted. Behind the wreckage, barely visible in the haze, stood the faint silhouette of a little blonde girl, watching us. Before I could even process it, the scene shifted again, and I was back on the bench. The anguish of watching my mother's death pulsed through me, raw and unending. I felt rooted to the spot, my hand still locked against hers, unable to pull away. Her smile was wrong now, stretched, almost predatory, with a gleam in her eyes that looked less and less human. Then, suddenly, a hand gripped my wrist. I turned, and there she was, that same girl, now beside me on the back of the bus. The road ahead loomed, the guardrail gleaming faintly in the mist as we careened towards it. I felt that dreadful, hollow certainty rising in my throat. Just before the bus would smash through the barrier, she whispered, "Do you want to be here?" Her voice echoed through the chaos, but I couldn't answer. The silence strangled me, and then the horror began again, crashing through the air, smashing into the water, the sickening crush of my bones. Back at the bench. The fog was thicker, pressing in on all sides. My breath came in shallow gasps, my body aching with each return. I looked helplessly at her, but her grin only widened. And then again, the wreckage, the table, the bus, and the table again. She dragged me back and forth through the same two hells, each loop blurring into the next. Sometimes she watched me from a distance. Other times she sat right beside me, her eyes empty and unfeeling. Each replay brought fresh pain. Every crash, every scream, every glimpse of my mother's broken face carved deeper into my soul. She forced me to relive it all, over and over, trapping me in a torturous cycle that felt endless. I wanted to believe the agony would numb eventually, but it only compounded. My suffering was infinite, an ever-growing way I could not escape. Finally, something changed. The bus scene shifted, and now it was just her and me, no driver, no one else. We glided silently towards the cliff's edge, as if pulled by an unseen force. She gripped my arm, her face inches from mine, and asked again, "Do you want to be here?" For the first time, my voice broke through the silence. "No," I whispered. She only grinned, a smile I had come to despise, and leaned in close. "Just one last thing to see," she said softly. In an instant, we were somewhere else. I stood on a rocky shore, gazing over a perfectly still deep blue lake, framed by towering mountains under a slate-gray sky. The tranquility was haunting. I hadn't felt anything close to peace in what felt like an eternity. But the silence shattered. From above, I heard the screech of tires. I looked up, and there it was, the sharp turn on the road perched high over the lake. The school bus burst through the guardrail, twisting midair as it plummeted toward the water. Time slowed. I could see every detail, the crushed front, the pale faces of my classmates, their mouths open in silent, frozen screams. And somewhere in the mix of terror and silence, just before the bus hit the lake, I could hear her voice soft, almost taunting, whispering in my ear, "Do you want to be here?" Tom's scream sliced through the air, sharp and frantic, a sound that pierced through the rest of the chaos. Time snapped back to its relentless pace, and in a sickening moment, the bus struck the water, sending waves rippling outward. The tail of the bus bobbed briefly above the surface, hovering for an eerie, weightless second before it began its slow descent, sinking deeper and deeper. Behind me, a voice murmured, clear and chilling, "Go, there's still time. Save him." My body moved on its own. I plunged into the water, each stroke carrying me closer to the bus as it slipped beneath the surface. I pushed forward, the cold seeping into my bones, desperate to reach the last visible row. And there, in the window, was Tom, hands reaching out, eyes locked on mine, filled with an agony that clawed into my soul. I stretched out, fingers grasping, but he was just out of reach, the bus sinking faster than I could follow. It vanished, swallowed by the dark depths, leaving me alone in the silent water. I drifted there, suspended in a sudden eerie calm. Then I turned back to the shore, and there she was, the girl, or whatever she was. She stood with that off-kilter, impossible posture, a silhouette too crooked to be human. My stomach twisted, and I tried to scream, tried to curse her, to demand answers, but no sound came. When I closed my eyes, willing myself to break free of this nightmare, I awoke in my own bed, gasping. Downstairs, I heard muffled sobs. My foster mother's voice broke through the silence, a trembling whisper. The bus, the one Tom was on, it crashed. Into a lake. They can't find anyone. Her words hit me like ice, and she couldn't even bear to look at me. My mind struggled to make sense of it. Tom's bus, the cliff, the cold water. But I'd been here at home. I had never gotten on that bus. I'd feigned a fever, stayed home, yet every detail of that day haunted me in vivid, torturous clarity. The crash was real. It happened just as I'd seen it. The bus barreling through the guardrail, plummeting to the lake below, taking my brother and 22 others with it. No one knew why, and no explanation ever came. And I, the one who stayed behind, am trapped in an unbroken cycle of hollow days and restless nights. Every night, I'm forced back to that lake, to that bus, reliving the slow-motion horror of Tom's last moments. Or I'm pulled back to the mangled memory of my mother's death, her hand just beyond reach. The pain, the terror, they cling to me, each detail seared into my mind as though it had truly happened, though it shouldn't have, not in this reality. I've never stepped into a car since that day. I know sleep only as a brief respite, before I'm flung back into that endless torment, forced to relive it again and again. And sometimes, lying there in the cold darkness, I wonder if somewhere, in some twisted version of this world, there is another version of me, the one who stayed on that bus, who endured something far worse than I did. But no matter where I am, no matter which reality I find myself in, one thing remains certain. Every time I ask myself that question, the answer is always the same. I don't want to be here.